What's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. David Anders. Thank you so much for your show. I love listening to you and all that you do. I'll try to make this quick because I know you've got a lot of calls on the line. Yesterday you had said that the Eucharist was absolutely not the point of going to Mass.
No, I
The
said
point
receiving
was-
communion. I said receiving communion was not the point of going to Mass.
Right, sorry. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, receiving communion was absolutely not the point of going to Mass.
Not the primary point.
Oh, okay. I thought, yeah, I didn't catch that primary part. The point actually, I believe, was the point to go, you said the point was to add our thoughts to the sacrifice of the Mass, and that for the first 1,000 years, people didn't even receive the Eucharist. So I guess my question was, in that case, if we're physically able to go to Mass, and we can just add our thoughts to the sacrifice, whether we're within 20 feet or a mile, what would be the difference? And also, didn't Jesus command us in John 6 to whoever eats in my, whoever remains in me and I, and
Thank you, Judy. These are wonderful questions. I really appreciate them. So you got the story mostly right. There's the few details that are a little bit off, and those details matter. Okay. So first of all, I never said that people didn't receive communion for the first 1,000 years. What I said was, there was a 1,000-year period in the church's history in which the lay people did not receive communion frequently. Okay? And the law of the church from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, in fact, was that the laity should receive communion once a year, or at least once a year. And so there was a very, very long history in the Latin Catholic West of annual communion by the lay faithful. Annual communion. Not that they never received communion, but they would receive communion perhaps annually. All right. And if you will read the sermons of St. John Vianney, for example, who's an 18th century French Catholic priest and the patron, actually, of all Catholic priests, his Easter sermons are instructive. All right, because he's preaching to a congregation that is accustomed to the idea of rigorous self-examination and preparation for their Easter communion. All right, and that's the whole cycle of his Easter sermons is ordered, or his Lenten sermons, I should say, is ordered towards, prepare yourself for your annual communion. All right, that'd be a good example to kind of see how that spirituality played out in the life of the Catholic faithful. Okay. So the question is, first of all, why is that the case? Why is it that for 1,000 years or so, Latin Catholics rarely receive communion, but say maybe once a year? And then your second question is then, also you said, you characterized my position as adding your thoughts to the sacrifice. And that's not exactly the way I put it. I'd like to qualify that as well. How then are we primarily to associate ourselves with the sacrifice of the Mass, if it's not uniquely by receiving Holy Communion? And then what point in actual physical presence at the sacrifice? Those are the things we'll deal with. All right. So first of all, the Council of Trent taught, following sacred tradition, that the Eucharist is two things. It's two things. This is why I stopped at the beginning and said, no, I didn't say the Eucharist, I said receiving communion. The Eucharist is two things. It is first of all a sacrifice offered to God in reparation for the sins of the world. And it is secondarily a sacrament. Okay, let's break those down. A sacrifice is something of value that we give to God. Okay? And Jesus uses the language of sacrifice when he institutes the holy sacrifice of the Mass. This is my body which is given up. Okay, it's the language of sacrifice. And when he speaks about the blood of the covenant, this is a reference to Exodus 24, when Moses slaughters an animal to inaugurate the Mosaic covenant, sprinkles the people and says, this is the blood of the covenant. Jesus says the same thing. This is the blood of the new covenant, essentially. Okay, so he uses sacrificial language in the institution of the rite, and the Church has always understood the Mass, the Holy Eucharist, to be principally and above all a sacrifice, something that we offer to God. There's all kinds of reasons for that. One of them is that to offer God sacrifice is the principal act of the virtue of religion. St. Paul tells us that we must offer our bodies as living sacrifices, and that this is our spiritual act of worship. To offer sacrifice is of the essence of true religion. All right, if I'm not willing to give up something to God, then my devotion means nothing. All right. Now, the sacrifice of goats and bulls of the Old Testament, they're not proportionate to God's infinite majesty, because they're just goats and bulls. But the sacrifice of his very own Son, you remember we pray in the Divine Mercy Chaplet, Eternal Father, I offer you the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. All right, in reparation for my sins and for the sins of the whole world. Okay, so it's not simply a matter of adding my thoughts. All right, it's a matter of intentionally offering the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus to God in reparation for my sins and those of the whole world. All right, that intentional act of saying, God, I offer you this sacrifice in reparation for my sins, and of joining the sacrifice of my very life, my joys, my sufferings, my sorrows, and my prayers, along with that of the sacrifice of Christ, which sanctifies them and makes them worthy to be given to God as an offering of praise, thanksgiving, reparation, and so forth. Okay, now my physical presence at the sacrifice is necessary uh, because number one, it is a corporate act. Right, the sacrifice of the Mass is the sacrifice of the whole church. All right, living and dead. Yeah. Saints in heaven are there too. We recall them in the canon of the Mass and invoke their prayers as we offer this sublime offering to God. So it's an action of the entire church, all right? And our corporate presence together is an expression of our identity as one body in Christ, as we collectively offer our lives to God. So it's very important that the church gather in worship to make this sublime offering. Now, the sacrifice, and so, right, why did the faithful only commune now, infrequently in the Middle Ages? Let me get to that point. The Eucharist, in addition to a sacrifice, is also a sacrament. What is a sacrament? A sacrament is a sacred sign that effects the thing symbolized. In this case, what is symbolized in the Eucharist is Christ's real presence with us. All right? How can you signify symbolically, more intimately, our need to feed upon Christ and dwell within him than by physical ingestion? All right? That is about as powerful a symbol as you can have of our need to dwell upon Christ and draw all our strength and nourishment from him. But like all the sacraments, it doesn't only symbolize that reality, it also effects it. Okay?
Okay.
Now, how often do you need to celebrate the reception of that sacrament in order for it to work psychologically upon you to convey the truth of Christ's presence with us? Well, that's a prudential question that the church can engage in any era, all right? And in its wisdom, the church decided that it wasn't entirely necessary that the lay faithful actually consume the sacred host on a frequent basis in order to benefit from the sacramental nature of the Eucharist. All right. Now, Pius X changed that and made it encouraged the lay faithful to receive communion very, very frequently. All right. But that's the prudential judgment for the modern era.
Sure.
Okay. Why would you do it infrequently? Well, one reason is that in the Middle Ages, there was and into early modernity, there was a much more acute sense on the part of the faithful of the Eucharist as a sacrifice. And so the principal mode of engagement in the Eucharist was to intentionally approach the Eucharist with that sacrificial aspect in view as the primary mode of engagement. All right, and so that's one of the reasons. The other one is that the eating of the sacrifice is also part of the sacrificial act, and so the consumption of the Blessed Sacrament by the priest completed the sacrificial action. Okay, so there you go.
Okay. Hey.